It started like any other quiet morning in the suburban neighborhood of Fair Hollow Pines, a community wrapped in a picturesque silence that fooled outsiders into thinking it was paradise. Our home, tucked neatly at the corner of Elm and Primrose, looked like every other house with its freshly trimmed hedges and crisp white porch railings, but what made it special was the warmth inside, the gentle laughter of my 8-year-old daughter, Ava, echoing through the halls as I helped her into her customized wheelchair. Ava was born with cerebral palsy and had spent her life defying every limit the world tried to place on her. Her spirit was a wildfire, bright, beautiful, and impossible to smother. And I, her mother, had built a life that revolved around ensuring that fire never dimmed. I had taken a step back from my career as a federal judge, a decision few in my circle understood. But to me, the choice was simple. Ava needed me more. My husband, Michael, passed away when Ava was just 2, and from that moment on, it was the two of us against the world. I thought the biggest battles we'd face would be doctor's appointments, therapy schedules, and the occasional insurance battle. But then Karen moved in. Karen Wilburn, sharp bob cut, manicured fingers, thin smile that never reached her eyes, was elected president of the HOA just 3 months after moving in, and the power she gained through that flimsy title transformed her into something vile. At first, it was small things: a glare when Ava giggled too loudly outside, a complaint about the unesthetic ramp installed at our front door, a citation for parking the wheelchair-accessible van too far left. I brushed it off, assuming it was her adjusting to the neighborhood or struggling with some internal bitterness that wasn't my business. But it didn't stop, it grew. She once knocked on our door at 6 a.m. to inform me our porch light had been left on overnight, claiming it violated HOA energy regulations. Another time, she stood in our yard measuring the grass with a ruler, accusing me of harboring neglectful landscaping. It would have been laughable if it hadn't started to affect Ava. My daughter, once fearless and curious, began hesitating before wheeling herself to the sidewalk. She asked why the lady with the angry face looked at her like she did something wrong. One evening, Ava came home from school in tears because Karen had stood near the bus stop and loudly asked the driver if it was safe to keep letting disabled kids roll around without supervision. I clenched my fists, every ounce of me wanting to respond, not just as her mother, but as the federal judge who had once held ruthless criminals accountable. But I told myself to stay calm, that this was petty neighborhood politics, and that I couldn't risk overreacting. But Ava's sadness ate at me. Her once vibrant art projects began showing darker colors: flames, stick figures with tears, a lady with a knife-like mouth. I decided to file a soft complaint to the HOA board, not a formal one, just an alert that a resident had been making inappropriate comments. The response? A curt letter from Karen herself, stating that I was being overly sensitive and that living in a shared community required tolerance of constructive feedback. The audacity of her tone made my blood boil. Still, I stayed quiet. Ava had just been approved for a groundbreaking therapy program that involved virtual simulation and aquatic rehabilitation. I didn't want to risk anything disrupting her eligibility. That same week, we held a small block party. I saw it as a chance to rebuild community ties and show Ava that not everyone here was like Karen. The neighbors came, even the new couple across the street brought their golden retriever, who Ava adored. Laughter filled the air, music played low, and for the first time in weeks, Ava smiled without worry. That's when Karen stormed over, clipboard in hand, her lips pursed in disgust. She announced to the group that we had violated HOA policy by hosting an unsanctioned gathering and that noise complaints had already been filed, though we hadn't even passed 8 p.m. She looked directly at Ava and said, "Some people think just because they're dealing with special situations, they can get away with anything." My hands shook. I stood ready to speak, but Ava tugged at my hand and whispered, "Let's just go inside." That night, I cried in the bathroom, silently so Ava wouldn't hear. I had spent years prosecuting felons, fighting for justice at the highest level of the judiciary, but I had never felt more powerless than I did against this woman with her clipboard and cold eyes. The next morning, we found red spray paint on our garage door. Rules are for everyone. I called the police, filed a report, and of course, the officer on duty, who happened to be Karen's cousin, said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue vandalism charges. The irony was thick, suffocating. Then came the letter, an official HOA violation stating that our wheelchair ramp was not uniform with neighborhood aesthetics and needed to be removed or replaced within 10 business days. I stared at the paper in disbelief. Ava needed that ramp. Her mobility and independence depended on it. I requested a formal exemption citing the Americans with Disabilities Act, attached doctor statements, even case law, but the HOA board, now fully under Karen's influence, denied it. That week, Karen stood outside our house every morning, watching as I carried Ava over the steps instead of using the ramp, her smug expression making my stomach churn. And then one afternoon, as Ava practiced painting outside, something her therapist had encouraged for emotional regulation, Karen stomped over, kicked over her easel, and screamed, "You're ruining my view with your pity art." Ava froze. Her hands trembled. She didn't speak. Karen stormed off, muttering something about how disabilities shouldn't be used as excuses to take over the community. That was the moment I snapped. I documented everything. I bought security cameras. I recorded audio. I contacted a civil rights attorney anonymously and began laying the groundwork for an official ADA violation complaint. But Karen, somehow sensing resistance, only became more volatile. She began banging on our door at night, leaving violation warnings on our windshield, and posting aggressive HOA bulletins targeting certain families who think they're above the rules. My neighbors grew silent, some out of fear, others out of complicity. And Ava, my sweet, brave Ava, began whispering at night that she had nightmares about Karen dragging her away. One morning, she refused to get in her chair. She said, "If I don't move, she won't see me." It shattered me. I promised her things would get better. I told her people like Karen always trip over their own cruelty. But I didn't know. I didn't know that Karen was about to do something that would make every cruelty before look like kindness. I didn't know that her hatred ran so deep, so violently unchecked, that she'd take it to a level I still struggle to speak of without trembling. All I knew, in that moment, was that something in the air had shifted. It was as if the neighborhood held its breath. A storm was coming, and we were standing at the edge of the flame. The change in Karen's behavior wasn't sudden, it was calculated, like a matchstick dragged ever so slowly across a box until the final strike bursts into fire. After the confrontation at the easel, her obsession with my daughter grew darker, more erratic. The HOA citations piled up, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single day, accusing us of violations so absurd they bordered on satire. Improper lawn, edge, alignment, unlicensed art activity, wheelchair drag marks on public sidewalk. And each violation came with a fine, small amounts, but they accumulated quickly, and failure to pay them came with threats of HOA litigation. She had weaponized the very structure meant to support community harmony, twisting it into a tool of personal vengeance. Still, I complied where I could, documented everything, and filed complaints with the city and disability rights offices. But bureaucracy moves slowly, and Karen's cruelty escalated faster than any paper trail could protect us. One morning, I stepped outside to find the security cameras I had installed smashed to pieces. I called the police again. Same precinct, same officer, same unconcerned response. "Could have been kids," he muttered as he wrote something half-hearted in his notepad. That night, Ava woke up screaming. She had dreamed Karen had pushed her down a hill in her chair and laughed while she rolled helplessly into traffic. I held her in my arms, whispering that she was safe, that no one would hurt her. But I didn't believe it. I began noticing Karen lurking near the edge of our yard more often, sometimes at odd hours. Her eyes followed Ava like a hawk tracking prey. She left little things behind, broken pencils on the ramp, piles of leaves swept deliberately in front of the wheels, even a torn drawing Ava had made, shredded and stuffed in our mailbox with a sticky note that read, "Not all art is welcome here." It became unbearable. I took a leave from work entirely, opting to stay home full time, not because Ava needed constant physical care, she was a fighter, doing more each day, but because I didn't trust Karen to keep her venom at a safe distance anymore. Then, one evening, I returned from the pharmacy to find Ava crying on the porch, her shirt wet, her paints gone. She told me Karen had come up to her, thrown a bucket of water over her head, and said, "Accidents happen when brats leave their garbage everywhere." I stormed over to Karen's house, rage coursing through my veins, and demanded an explanation, only for her to smirk and say, "Maybe you should keep your little science project inside where she belongs." That night, I filed a full report with the ADA and sent letters to every HOA oversight committee I could find. But the process would take weeks. We didn't have weeks. The next day, Karen stood in front of our house with a garden hose, spraying water across the sidewalk as Ava tried to wheel down for her therapy ride. She made a show of it, smiling like a lunatic, blocking Ava's path with fake ignorance. Ava's chair slipped on the wet pavement and she tumbled to the side, scraping her arms and bruising her hip. I rushed outside and screamed at Karen to stop, and she raised her eyebrows and said, "It's just water. Maybe your daughter's too fragile for the real world." I felt something in me begin to fracture, something maternal and primal. But still, I held back. That night, Ava wouldn't eat. She just sat silently, her drawings all blank pages now. She asked me, "Is she going to kill me?" And I didn't know how to answer. The dread inside me told me that if this continued, the answer might be yes. So I called the school and requested Ava attend remotely. We became isolated, housebound, surrounded by a community that pretended not to see what was happening. But Karen wasn't satisfied with that. The silence only emboldened her. One morning, I went out to check the mailbox and smelled something strange, a faint scent of gasoline. My heart pounded as I looked around. Behind the porch rail, I found a soaked rag hidden under a pile of leaves. I knew that smell. I'd ruled over arson cases before. I knew what it meant. I took photos, gloves, sealed the rag in a Ziploc bag. I contacted the fire marshal, but again, the response was lukewarm. Hard to prove intent, they said, could be leftover yard work chemicals. But I knew. I knew what Karen was planning. I increased security, bought new cameras, this time hiding them in birdhouses and garden gnomes. For a few days, there was quiet, a deceptive calm. Ava started painting again, though hesitantly. Her therapist encouraged small steps, and we spent one sunny afternoon in the backyard. Just her and I, laughing as we painted sunflowers. That night, she kissed me goodnight and said, "I like today. Thank you for today." I tucked her in, turned off the lights, and stood outside her room longer than usual, watching her sleep. The next morning shattered everything. It was a Saturday, bright and breezy. I went inside to make breakfast while Ava sat in her chair on the patio, painting quietly. We had just begun rebuilding peace. That's when I smelled smoke. I spun around and saw the thin black line rising above the backyard fence. I ran outside. I screamed. Flames were licking the side of Ava's chair, her paints on fire, her clothes catching. And Karen stood on the other side of the fence, a red gas can at her feet, eyes wide, mouth twisted in sick glee. Ava's screams pierced the air, and for a moment, the world stood still. I grabbed the garden hose, doused her, screaming, shaking, crying. My hands moved faster than my thoughts, patting out flames, tearing burning fabric off her skin, checking her breathing. Her face was blistered, her arms blackened in patches, the wheelchair partly melted. The ambulance arrived minutes later, sirens wailing through the once quiet streets of Fair Hollow Pines. I rode with Ava, my hands covered in soot and her blood, her tiny fingers gripping mine even through the pain. She didn't scream anymore, just stared ahead, eyes full of betrayal and shock. At the hospital, doctors rushed to work. The burns were second and third degree, covering almost 30% of her body. They sedated her quickly. I sat outside the room, motionless, barely registering the police questions being asked until one of them said, "Do you have proof she did this?" And I looked up, eyes burning. "Yes," I said, "and when I show it to you, you'll regret ever asking me that." Because I did have proof. One of the new hidden cameras, disguised as a decorative garden light, caught it all. Karen sneaking into the yard, pouring gasoline, striking a match, watching my daughter burn. I handed over the footage that night. The officers' expressions changed instantly. One even turned pale. Still, Karen hadn't been arrested yet. They said they needed to verify chain of custody and prepare a warrant. The system crawled while my daughter lay fighting in a hospital bed. I sat beside her through the night, watching machines breathe for her, IVs pumping fluids into her small, scarred body. I remembered every defendant I'd ever sentenced, rapists, traffickers, murderers, and realized none of them made me feel as much hate as I did in that moment. And Karen? She went home that night. She slept. She laughed. She breathed. I saw her through the window when I drove by our house the next day to grab clothes. She was drinking wine on her porch like nothing had happened. But it wasn't over. Not for her. Because what she didn't know was that the woman she tried to destroy wasn't just a grieving mother. I was a federal judge. I had spent decades learning how to take down monsters like her. And I wasn't going to stop until the last thing Karen ever saw was a courtroom, a jury, and the gavel coming down on her life. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and grief, like sterilized pain, and the echoes of parents too broken to speak. I sat there in that white, suffocating room, watching my baby girl fight for her life with half her body wrapped in gauze and tubes threading in and out of her like a science experiment gone cruel. Ava was unconscious for the first 72 hours, and in that time, something inside me hardened beyond repair. The doctors warned of permanent scarring, muscle loss, and months of rehabilitation. One even cautioned that she might never use her right arm fully again. But what broke me more than their predictions was seeing Ava's tiny face, swollen, blistered, and pale, twitch in pain even in sleep. The nurses did their best. Her burn specialist was kind, and her anesthesiologist held my hand when I wept silently into the folds of Ava's hospital blanket. But no medicine could dull what burned inside me. Not even fire could match the fury building beneath my skin. I had spent the last few years suppressing the part of me that once wore a black robe in courtrooms with murderers and traffickers standing before me. I left that behind to be a mother full time, but now, as I sat there powerless beside the hospital bed, the judge inside me awakened, and she was seething. Karen had not yet been arrested. The footage I gave the police had been reviewed, but bureaucratic red tape now held up the issuance of an arrest warrant. They told me the district attorney was still evaluating the degree of charges and waiting on a fire marshal's supplemental report. Meanwhile, Karen walked freely. She didn't even try to hide. She posted smiling photos on social media, sipping coffee in yoga pants, and sharing updates about restoring order to the community after false accusations. The morning news ran a brief clip of the fire. The report was vague, a local child injured in a suspected backyard accident, but no names were given. Karen was protected by the same system she had exploited, and Ava was buried under the silence of the law. But not for long. I went home briefly the following week to gather more clothes and legal documents, and I stepped into my office, dusty, untouched for nearly a year. I stared at my degrees on the wall, Yale Law, Harvard Judicial Training, and the framed newspaper clipping from my biggest federal case, where I'd taken down a corrupt pharmaceutical executive. My fingers hovered over the drawer of my desk before I yanked it open. Inside were files, records, digital backups of contacts, old prosecutors, federal investigators, ADA specialists. I was no longer sitting this war out. I made calls. I set appointments. I emailed every contact who owed me a favor, and there were plenty. I submitted the video footage to private forensic analysts to accelerate authentication. I subpoenaed HOA records using an old friend's legal letterhead. I discovered that Karen had previously been sued in a different state for unlawful discrimination, a case involving a veteran in a wheelchair that the HOA settled quietly before she relocated here. I uncovered HOA financials that showed Karen had siphoned off community funds into unapproved landscaping projects, which coincidentally were all on her own property line. I even found anonymous complaints buried in community records from elderly residents who feared retaliation if they spoke out. Karen was a monster with a long trail of rot behind her, and now I had everything I needed to bury her legally. But I didn't stop there. While the local authorities dragged their feet, I went federal. I contacted a civil rights litigator who specialized in ADA hate crimes. I called in media favors, a former journalist I once helped protect during a dangerous cartel trial now worked as a senior producer at a national network. She listened, horrified, and promised airtime. I launched a social campaign with Ava's story omitting our full names for safety, but including the burned art, the security footage stills, and Ava's therapy photos. Within a day, the post reached 60,000 shares. Within a week, it was on national headlines. HOA president allegedly sets disabled child on fire. Police delay arrest. The pressure became unbearable for local law enforcement. Protesters showed up outside the HOA building. Disability rights activists held signs outside Karen's home. The police chief, clearly panicked, finally signed the arrest warrant. Karen was taken into custody, not with a dramatic chase, but with a coward's whimper. She tried to argue with the arresting officers. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "That little girl was a fire risk. I warned them." Her insanity was finally on display for the world to see. The mugshot aired that night, and I watched it in the hospital room beside Ava, her fingers twitching softly. The room was quiet, the only sounds the beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of TV commentary. They finally got her. I whispered to Ava, brushing a strand of hair from her healing forehead. "She's going to pay." But that wasn't enough. A simple criminal trial wouldn't balance the scales. I filed a federal lawsuit against Karen, the HOA board, and every individual who ignored my repeated ADA violation notices. I used my old bar connections to fast-track it into federal court, where the judiciary couldn't be influenced by local corruption. I demanded damages for attempted murder, ADA hate crime violations, emotional trauma, and systemic negligence. My filings were meticulous, each line dripping with righteous fury dressed in perfect legal precedent. The community, suddenly realizing they had sided with a lunatic, began turning their backs on Karen. The same neighbors who once nodded silently as she issued violations now begged to provide character statements for Ava. But I didn't forget their silence. Nor did I forgive it. Ava awoke a few days after Karen's arrest. Her voice was faint, her breathing labored. But her first words shattered my heart. Did she burn my paintings? I held her close and promised her we would make new ones, better ones, stronger ones. She nodded, and despite her pain, gave me a tiny, lopsided smile. It was all I needed to stay strong. As Ava began her long road to recovery, skin grafts, nerve treatments, physical therapy, I prepared for court. Karen, now released on bond, tried to paint herself as the victim. Her lawyers claimed the fire was accidental, that she never meant to harm the child, and that the gaskin was for yard work. But the footage, the timeline, the pattern, it crushed every lie. I sat across from her in a pre-trial hearing, her eyes darting to mine. She didn't recognize me at first, dressed in formal black again, binder in hand. Then it clicked. She paled. Her mouth twitched. I leaned forward and said, quietly, "You tried to destroy a child. Now, I'm going to destroy everything you are by the law." She didn't respond. Her attorney did all the talking now. But the real storm hadn't even hit yet. I wasn't just preparing to convict Karen. I was preparing to expose the entire corrupt system that enabled her, from the HOA's selective enforcement policies to the local police's casual dismissal of ADA complaints. This wasn't personal vengeance anymore. This was going to become a landmark case, a warning to every HOA across the country, a wake-up call for every parent who had been silenced. I spent each night beside Ava's hospital bed with case files spread around me, court documents highlighted, and timelines mapped out. And as her skin slowly healed, so did her courage. She began to ask questions again. She began to draw again, simple things at first like butterflies and flowers. But one night, she drew herself, not as the burned girl in a hospital bed, but as a superhero with flames in her palms, hovering above the ground, untouchable. I framed it. It hangs in my office now, because that's who Ava became. Not a victim, but a fire the world couldn't put out. And Karen? She was about to learn what it meant to light a match in the path of a mother who had once written sentences for war criminals. Because when court began, I wasn't just Ava's mother. I was the law. The courtroom was packed, not just with attorneys and reporters, but with survivors, parents, activists, and neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to the cruelty growing in their community, now sitting silently in the wooden pews like witnesses to a storm they never imagined would touch them. I walked through the doors not as a grieving mother, but as a woman transformed, dressed in sharp black, hair tightly pinned, eyes full of quiet, controlled fury. It had taken months to get to this day. Months of depositions, forensic evidence, interviews, federal filings, expert testimonies, and preparations so extensive it felt like a war campaign. Ava, though still recovering, insisted on being present. Her scars still healing, she sat in her wheelchair beside my legal team, her eyes focused and brave, clutching a small sketchbook with the cover decorated in gold marker that read, "For the fire that couldn't burn me down." Karen sat across the aisle, gaunt, pale, her hair limp, and face absent of the smugness she once wore like a badge of honor. She wasn't smirking now. Her defense attorney had argued for leniency, trying to convince the judge and jury that what happened was a tragic accident, that she suffered from mental distress brought on by the pressures of HOA responsibility, and that there was no direct proof she intended to harm my daughter. But they didn't know what we had. When I was called to the stand, I gave my testimony not as an emotional parent, but as a composed legal expert, laying out the sequence of events with chilling clarity. I introduced the footage, the hidden camera in the garden gnome, the clear view of Karen stepping into our yard with a red gas can, her crouched figure pouring it on Ava's painting area, the exact moment her hand struck the match and flicked it onto the canvas before slipping through the side gate and watching the flames rise. There were gasps across the courtroom. A reporter dropped his pen, and even the judge, a seasoned federal magistrate with decades of experience, leaned forward with sharpened eyes. I presented photos of Ava's injuries, the burns, the surgeries, the early medical reports that documented third-degree damage and risk of permanent disability. I then displayed a timeline of my prior ADA complaints, HOA denials, and even recorded voicemails of Karen mocking Ava, calling her a neighborhood hazard and a circus on wheels. The evidence formed a noose around Karen's defense. The prosecution followed with expert witnesses, fire marshals confirming the burn pattern was deliberate, a forensic psychiatrist dismissing the insanity plea, and even a retired HOA advisor who stated on record that Karen's actions and leadership violated every known standard of homeowner governance. Karen was then called to the stand, and for the first time, her mask truly cracked. She sobbed, ranted, tried to blame stress, even claimed that Ava shouldn't have been outside unattended. The prosecutor calmly pointed out that Ava was in a gated yard under a camera and that Karen had knowingly entered private property with a fuel container and fled the scene. When Karen tried to say, "I didn't mean to hurt her," a single voice echoed from the gallery, Ava's, as she quietly whispered, "But you did." Silence fell. Even the jury turned toward Ava, who looked back at Karen not with fear, but with the kind of strength only a child who has walked through fire and lived can carry. Closing arguments were delivered with the weight of history behind them. I watched the jurors' faces, some teary-eyed, others hardened with fury, as they heard how a woman entrusted with neighborhood leadership turned it into a weapon against the most vulnerable. The defense tried one final play, a plea deal suggestion for reduced time in exchange for a public apology. But I stood, looked the judge in the eye, and said, "No deal. My daughter's pain wasn't negotiable. Justice isn't either." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder aggravated assault, child endangerment, arson, hate crime enhancement under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and federal civil rights violations. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled. The judge called for order and then turned to Karen with the final sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gallery gasped again, and Karen collapsed in her seat, sobbing uncontrollably. But I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief, the kind that comes when justice has finally undeniably been served. Over the following weeks, the story spread globally. National news outlets dubbed it the HOA fire trial, and Ava's name became a symbol of resilience. She was invited to speak on children's rights panels. Artists donated paintings to her. A foundation was created in her honor, the Ava Grace Fund, which would go on to support burn victims, disabled youth, and legal battles against HOA abuse. As for the HOA in Fair Hollow Pines, it was dismantled completely. The board members were either fined, barred from leadership, or publicly shamed. The community changed radically. They replaced the iron signs at the entrance with a plaque that read, "This neighborhood stands for every child, every voice, every right." Ava came home a hero. Her first day back was a neighborhood parade led by fire trucks and disability advocates. People cheered, cried, apologized. Ava just smiled, held her sketchbook, and waved. She had survived something no child ever should, and yet she had become more than a survivor. She was a firebrand, a legend. And me? I returned to law, not as a federal judge, but as an advocate. I began touring courts, speaking at judicial panels, writing policy aimed at protecting children with disabilities, and holding HOAs federally accountable. Because what happened to Ava was preventable. And because if someone like Karen could exist in one neighborhood, she could exist in thousands. I made it my mission to ensure no parent ever faced that nightmare alone. Ava still draws. She now paints in golds and reds, bold colors she once feared. Her scars remain, but so does her fire. And every time I look at her, I don't see pain or loss. I see power, strength, and a child who rose from the ashes of hate to become the voice that silenced it forever. Karen thought she was targeting a weak child and an exhausted mother. What she didn't know was that she had declared war on a judge who never lost a case, and a little girl whose spirit fire couldn't kill. And in the end, it wasn't the match she lit that defined her fate. It was the one she handed to the wrong mother.